US non-farm payrolls came in at 4.8 million, beating expectations for 3 million. Meanwhile, the unemployment rate improved to 11.1% from 13.3% in the prior month as the impact from the coronavirus starts to ease. However, the United States is still the country with the highest total cases of COVID-19 around the world. Joining me to discuss the outlook for the US and global economy is Professor Steve Hanke from the Department of Economics at the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. Professor Hanke, great to speak to you again. Let's just start with your global economic outlook. What kind of a shape of recovery are you anticipating?
Well, I'm anticipating the initial opening of the economies will result in what they call kind of what looks like a V-shaped recovery, because you're essentially starting from zero and dialing up a little bit. So things will look like they're getting better rapidly, and they will be getting better rapidly. But then all the problems begin, because this impact of the virus and all the lockdown, shutdowns, and so forth, which have been basically directed by, the central planners and the public health type people who haven't paid any attention to the economy, with the exception of one place, Sweden. Sweden has tried to balance the economy and keep it running while also dealing with the virus, and that's the only liberal model of economic and public health response to the virus. Everybody else has been in some phase of hard lockdown, basically ignoring the economy altogether. The damage that's been done with that approach is massive, and all these so-called supply chains that have been disrupted are going to be hard to put back together again. Point number one, there'll be many bankruptcies as this thing drags on. So that's, again, something hard to put back together again. In other words, somebody goes bankrupt, the building is still there, the capital stock's still there, but you got to get new management, new employees, try to figure out if you're actually going to even open again, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think we will come up to the level of real GDP that we experienced prior to the virus until at least late in 2022, and it might be well beyond 2022. And one reason, by the way, that people have underestimated the damage that's been done, if you look at GDP in the economy, that's the value of all final goods and services sold in the economy. But there's something called gross output, and gross output in the United States, for example, is about double the size of GDP. Now, what is gross output? Gross output includes all the supply chain intermediate transactions that take place prior to reaching GDP. So all of that's been disrupted, and the magnitude, of course, is massive, because gross output, as I say, is actually double the size of GDP. So that's my overall at 30,000 foot kind of level, without getting into specific countries and things like that.
When it comes to the United States, what type of a recession or even depression are you bracing for? And how's that likely to compare to 2008? I mean, are you encouraged by the fact that the US economy is reopening and some of the data is starting to improve? Or is that just the fact that we're coming from a very low base?
Oh, relative to 2008, the problem is massive, much greater than 2008. 2008 is peanuts compared to what's going on now.
And what about the risk of a second wave? How are you kind of factoring that into your estimates for the outlook for the US? And does that imply that you're expecting us to head into a depression more than a recession if 2008 looks like peanuts compared to today?
Oh, there'll be many waves. You talk about a second. No, there'll be many. There'll be all kinds of bumps in the road consistent with what I originally said, and that is the supply chain disruption is much, much greater than we think. It's again, if you look at those supply chains and the financial transactions within those are about twice the size of GDP. These intermediate transactions, that's where all this disruption is, and putting you're going to have trouble putting Humpty Dumpty back together again. That's basically the problem. And so there'll be all kinds of speed bumps in the road, and forget about the second wave. There'll be second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. That's public health epidemiology talk, not economic talk. The epidemiologists know nothing about economics. It's clear that their approach they've used in all these lockdowns and the so-called expert advice they've been given, except in Sweden, has been all geared towards public health ideology and has nothing to do with the economy. I mean, for them, the economic shutdown is a zero cost. I mean, they don't consider that a cost.
Now, we've spoken about quite a few Latin American countries in the past. Let's just talk about Argentina, because that's been fighting really hard to tackle its fiscal deficit. But what has the coronavirus really meant for its progress, given the declines both in terms of tax revenue and, of course, rising government spending as well?
Well, Argentina is a special case because they're one of the 4 countries in the world that are actually in default right now in their sovereign debt, and the provincial debts will almost all default too. So the corona, it's a very vulnerable economy in the sense that it was already in the tank even before the virus hit. Now the virus hit, it just aggravates things, and they're even further down in the tank. I'm the only one that measures inflation accurately in Argentina, and today the annual inflation rate's 71% per annum. So the big problem there is the central bank and the peso. This has been going on for over 100 years, and they have to get rid of the peso and replace it with the US dollar. That's what people do spontaneously and privately in Argentina anyway, but they have to get rid of the central bank. The central bank and the peso are the problems. They always end up financing fiscal deficits and public spending largesse in Argentina. They get the country into trouble. I mean, they've gone through now, we've had two huge sovereign defaults in 10 years in Argentina. So it's the biggest deadbeat in the world. I mean, it's a complete deadbeat country, which is unfortunate. It has a lot of potential, but I think it's just run off the road again. They have trouble staying on the road, and the reason why is the central bank.
What about Venezuela then? Because obviously we know it's grappling with a whole host of economic issues. I know you study inflation a lot, and rampant inflation has certainly been one of its key economic woes. The coronavirus, no doubt, adding to its problems. Talk to us about just how bad the situation is there.
Well, it's kind of almost unimaginable. I mean, when I was President Caldera's advisor in 1995 and 1996, there were all kinds of problems. That's why he brought me in as an advisor. And my advice was they had to put the central bank in a straitjacket, adopt a currency board law to run it where the bolivar would be issued. It would be backed 100% by US dollars. It would trade freely at a fixed exchange rate with the US dollar. The bolivar then would be a clone of the US dollar. Everything would be fine. You'd have a hard budget constraint in the system. The central bank wouldn't be allowed to extend credit to the fiscal authorities and so forth. It never happened. He didn't have the votes to get it. Then we had Chavez, and we have Madeira, and we have a hyperinflation going on in one of the longest ones in world history. Today, I just measured the inflation rate. It's 2,495% per year in Venezuela. So it's the only hyperinflating country in the world. It's a complete basket case. I mean, if if Argentina is in the tank, Venezuela is a basket case. Let's put it that way. All these Latin American countries, Victoria, all these Latin American countries, the problem is they have central banks, almost all of them, except, well, we've got two in Central America, Panama and El Salvador, that are dollarized and more or less under, well, Panama does very well. It's been dollarized for over 100 years. And then in South America, we do have Ecuador is dollarized and doesn't really have a central bank that operates with discretionary monetary policy. So they all should get rid of their central banks and their local currencies, or if they keep the local currencies, they should have currency board arrangements that make those local currencies clone of the anchor, which would be the US dollar.
Yeah, and that ties in with the piece that you wrote in the National Review, basically saying that exchange rate instability is a curse with the onset of the coronavirus and currencies taking a deep dive around the world. And you say that the prospect of private currency boards, which are either backed by stable fiat currencies or gold, is the promising one. So tell us a bit more.
Well, one way around the government monopolies, namely central banks, is to just simply issue private money, and people could use a private money. Now, what would that be? How would that work? Well, you'd have a private currency board. My recommendation has always been to have those housed in Switzerland, have the reserves held in Switzerland, have them operate under Swiss law. This is all for security, credibility, and all the rest of it. And then you'd issue a private money, and that private money would be backed 100% with, let's say, gold. This would be very attractive in some place like Turkey, Iran, Russia, even Lebanon is in the middle of a huge currency crisis right now. So if you did that, you would have gold reserves backing whatever the currency, private currency was that you were issuing. And what would that mean? That currency would be a clone or equivalent of gold, because it would trade at an absolutely fixed exchange rate. You'd have 100% gold reserves backing the currency, so it would have full credibility. If you didn't like your currency, the private currency, you take it in and exchange it for gold, and vice versa, of course. So I think this is the most promising thing, because it can be done now, as we know, even with something that isn't a currency like Bitcoin. Bitcoin is not a currency. It's not a currency because it's a highly speculative asset that its price is fluctuating all over the place. So it isn't a stable unit of account, meaning it can't really qualify as a currency. No one really is going to be doing contracts or much by way of transactions, certainly long-term transactions in Bitcoin, because it would be like having a yardstick to measure things, and the length of the yardstick would be fluctuating all over the place. You'd never get the measurements right. And if you're trying to build a house or even put up drapes in your house, I mean, one day the drapes might be all over the floor, and then the next day they're halfway up the window. So you have to have something. You have to have something stable.
The final last question. You said that Hong Kong remains the world leader in handling the coronavirus. I mean, what are some of the lessons do you think that countries like the US and Brazil that are still struggling can be learned from the example?
Well, I think it's really gets down to the 5 Ps. Prior preparation prevents poor performance. And in some places like Singapore and Hong Kong, for example, and Sweden, you have, or Taiwan, you have had the 5 Ps in place. Prior preparation prevents poor performance. They were prepared. They were ready and knew what they were doing. Every place else, it's all been ad hoc with a lot of public health kind of officials running around, clearly not having a very good idea of what they're doing. And the data, by the way, are terrible. So you're operating it's like flying blind. If you're a pilot in a plane and you can't see all the instruments, or the instruments are giving you phony numbers, you got a problem. And that's what's going on in most places.
All right, Professor Hanke, thank you so much for your time. As always, it was great to chat to you again.
Thank you. Yeah, great to talk to you, Victoria. Have a great day.
You too. That was Professor Steve Hanke from the Department of Economics at the Johns Hopkins University. I'm Victoria Scholar, and thank you so much for watching IGTV.
For more videos like these, subscribe to our YouTube channel, IG UK, and make sure to follow us on Twitter. We're at IGTV.